Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading. Then we examine a single relevant question that passage points us to. Today I'm joined by Alyssa, Bream, and we're looking at a passage from Luke chapter 4. After this introduction of the births of John the Baptist and Jesus, it became clear that God was doing something. After all these years of promises, God was moving forward his plan to save mankind. Now we are taken, though, to the initial events of Jesus' early ministry, his water baptism, the temptation in the wilderness, and his first message in his hometown of Nazareth. And so Luke begins presenting the events of the birth of John and Jesus, and then the early events of Jesus' ministry as this fulfillment of God's plan. So when Jesus went to Nazareth, he was asked to give the reading in the synagogue from the scroll of the prophets. And he found the place where Isaiah wrote, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim that captives will be released, that the blind will see, that the oppressed will be set free, and that the time of the Lord's favor has come." This was a prophecy that would happen when the day of the Messiah finally arrived. The controversy occurred not because the passage Jesus read, but because of what he said when he finished reading it. When he finished reading it, he says, "The scripture you just heard has been fulfilled this very day." So in other words, Jesus was claiming that his ministry was the ministry of the Messiah. But beyond the controversy, there is some insight into who Jesus' message is for. So he says the gospel is for the poor. So in ancient times, one's status in the community was not so much a function of money or wealth, but on things such as education, gender, family, heritage, religious purity, vocation, economics. Any condition that makes the person weak and outcast of society means the person is one of the poor. So Jesus' message is for those who are on the outside. He says, my message, the gospel is for the captive. So being a captive was especially significant in Israel because of their sin. God had allowed Israel to be taken into captivity. And to be released from captivity was more than just being freed from the rule of a nation that ruled over Israel. To be released from captivity would only occur when God totally removed the sin of his people. So Jesus' message is for those who need forgiveness from real sin and from the burden that it creates. He says the gospel's for the blind. So blindness is a metaphor for those who are without light, without insight, without hope, without revelation. The gospel message is aimed particularly at those who have no hope. He says the gospel's for the oppressed. Oppression is a description of the effects that are created by sin. All of the above references, being poor and outsider, captive, one without hope, create this heavy oppression as those conditions cause burdens that weigh upon one's shoulders. So whatever hardships and burdens have been created over one's life due to sin are answered by the gospel. And so I want to talk about this for a few minutes, Alyssa. How does the gospel reach and lift up people who are on the outside or outsiders?
Yeah, we see throughout a lot of Paul and the New Testament about the outsiders being welcomed in. And I think that part of the way that the gospel does that is the commitment to Jesus is easier than it was the commitment to being a Jew. To be a Jew, you had to have the family heritage, or you had to go through a process and then still not kind of be fully in the fold. There were men had to be circumcised. You had to do all of the rituals, and there was a lot to do. The festivals, all of that took a lot of preparation, a lot of time in order to be a religious Jew. I think Jesus, it's a very simple way to enter. It's believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and thou shalt. So I think, but the cost is greater. So I think it has to change your whole life. And I it's not that I don't think that being a Jew or being an Israelite changed your whole life, but I think that trajectory that it takes you on is different. So it brings in, it welcomes people who don't have the means to have the time to do all those things. It creates equality where there was lots of hierarchy, where there was, certain people could go so far in the temple, and then other people could go a little bit farther, and then only, a select few could go into the very center, and all of those things. Everyone has equal access. So it doesn't matter where you come from, everyone has equal access to Jesus. And that's the beautiful thing about the gospel, is that you can come not knowing a lot about Jesus, and it can change your whole life.
So, what are some different conditions of captivity that sin can create in our life? What are some examples that it might create for us?
Whenever I think about sin, when I try to kind of simplify the idea of sin, to generalize it, it always comes down to causing pain to others, mainly. That's a lot of the 10 commandments. It's when you do things that disrupt the relationship with those around you, when you cause harm to your neighbor by doing bad things. There's lots of bad things you can do to your neighbor in the 10 commandments. So I think that we're held captive by that because it creates distrust in relationships. It creates harm. It creates division. So any sort of sin that we commit against another person or against God, it just creates those boundaries. It creates those walls where we don't feel fully whole or fully present, and it creates that unease in our life. And so as we find Jesus, as we start to break down those boundaries, we're able to get out of that captivity, because we're able to break down those walls and to live in harmony with each other, because we're treating each other better than we would if we didn't have Jesus.
Yeah, I think some things are easy to spot that the average person identifies as captivity. So some substance addiction, we would easily say, they're held captive by sin. But there are so many others that I think we don't give enough credence to, and probably aren't. We're living in a different day, and addiction is a real problem, even among people who are functioning addicts. But we can become addicted to spending. We can become we become captive to. Okay, I've got to have the next thing. You've got to have. That's the only way I can get my fix for the day. And it creates financial headaches for us. The same is true in relationship. Occasionally you'll deal with a person that, or I will deal with a person that doesn't think their sin is a problem right at that particular moment. And I would say anytime there's something that we're unwilling to give up, we should probably check ourselves, as to the effect that it's having on us. And so I think sin probably holds us captive more than we realize it holds us captive. It may not be as obvious, right? There's lots of science right now about phones and the addiction that they are right now. There's even there's a push to put warning labels on social media for anybody under 13, right? Just like they did cigarette packs. But the reason why this is coming so rapidly is because we have seen how it holds us captive. Like what are we going to do without it, right? And I think we have to be aware of the effect that sin has on our life and our unwillingness to change,
Yeah.
whatever it is. It doesn't have to be drugs. There are times in my life where I am unwilling to change, or I'm resistant to changing. And 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 sometimes it's just a heart issue that needs to be.
It's kind of like sin holds us captive, but anything that holds us captive, like a phone isn't sin,
Mm-hmm.
but anything that holds us captive is sin also, because if we're giving it more power in our life than Jesus, then that's a problem.
Statistics are pushing 7-8 hours now. Average person's on their phone, and the younger generations, like the Z's, it's 10 to 12 a day that they're spending on their phones. And like you say, that's not a sin. But when you're spending 10 to 12 hours a day on your phone and you say, I don't have time to pray, or I don't have time to read my Bible, or I don't have time to go to church, there's like a real issue. And so captivity is sin in and of itself. Just before we wind this down, how does the gospel lift burdens that are created by sin? How do people feel lifted? Like,
to know that there is a way out, there is a better way. Sometimes that's all that you need in life, is to know that there is going to be an end to something, and Jesus is the answer. That's a very churchy phrase to say, but when we see the story of Jesus, when we're held captive by the story of Jesus rather than technology or substances or anything like that,
shopping,
we
whatever.
see that he cares for us, that he gets us. We see that he can change our whole life. And I think that sometimes all we need is that hope that change is possible. I look at this story that, of like Russell Brand, who is this like, I don't know if he'd be considered an A-list celebrity. Some people might know, either you know who he is or you don't. But he recently discovered Jesus and like has been going through a very public like transformation of getting baptized and learning about all these things. And
I've been following that.
Right.
I don't even know how I'm pretty selective about who I follow on Instagram, and I'm not on Instagram a lot, but randomly about 2 years ago, maybe longer than that. It's probably been longer than that. It was around COVID. He showed up he was making some, because that's what he does, is he talks about random things, and his hippie looking self. And, I listened. And so I thought, okay, I followed him. And then all of a sudden I started seeing this spiritual transformation. What I'm laughing at is just this past week. Did you see him? Have you seen the video of him baptizing people? The picture
I haven't
of him baptizing
seen that.
people?
No.
So, I see Daniel smiling. Daniel's seen it. So he is baptizing people in the river.
Okay.
It's a friend of his in his whitey tighties. Okay. And
This podcast took a turn.
Yeah. And the Christians eviscerate him. I mean, it's demonic. Him being, they're just killing him.
Yeah.
So he comes back and does this video, and you should watch it. And where he says, I didn't do it to show off my body. I did it because a friend of mine had this conversion and he wanted to be baptized, and I didn't want to get my clothes wet, so I went out in my underwear to baptize him. That's the reason behind it. And you're all over here screaming and hollering. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but he's had this huge revelation of Jesus. Now, there'd be some people who say he's also had some political transformation at the same time, but it's been fascinating to watch and hear him talk about, because the way it started was not just with the Bible. He started with a lot of different faiths trying to find out this spirituality thing. And where he landed was this revelation of Jesus. So I'm sorry.
But I think that just shows the story of Jesus is so powerful. And it really is a beautiful story. Now, the tidy whities thing I didn't even know about, so we'll take that out of this conversation. But I think it shows the power of the story, and to bring in people who, man, he was like Hollywood, like doing all sorts of crazy things, and has found, and he's willing to make the change. I've seen other times where he's done things and Christians are like, you shouldn't be doing that. And then he comes on, he's like, you know what? I didn't realize that tarot cards were bad. And I shot that before I was converted. And, I will not be doing that again.
Right.
And I think that's a beautiful story
Journey.
and way that we can appreciate the journey, because so much of us that grow up in the church have friends that grew up in the church, and we don't get to see those conversions as often.
And we were told, like, things like Ouija boards, all those kind of things would have been no-nos in the world that we grew up in. This whole burden lifting thing that you will almost hear, you will regularly hear people describe it that way. Like, they came and they prayed and it was like a weight was lifted. That may be the most common description of salvation. It's like this weight lifted off of me.
Right.
It's not that there's still not a journey ahead of you, or there are not consequences to the actions that you've already taken. But the hope that the burden that, okay, I'm not carrying this by myself anymore, that I can't figure it out, is a beautiful thing. Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us Monday as we continue a conversation around our daily Bible reading.